Gregor and the Prophecy of Bane, Chapter 16. The last thing we read was kind of gruesome, that the bat was eaten by the mites. Poor bat. Chapter 16. Pandora! Howard cried in horror. Pan! He scrambled up over the side of the boat and was about to dive into the water when Meredith yanked him back down. Release me, Meredith! We are bonds, said Howard. He thrashed about wildly in Meredith's grip. She is gone, Howard. You cannot help her, said Meredith. But Howard was unable to accept this. He twisted out of Meredith's hold and made for the side of the boat again. Meredith grabbed him by the arm, spun him around, and with one punch knocked him unconscious. Luxa caught Howard as he flew backward. She staggered back under his weight, but was able to break his fall as he landed. In the meantime, Ares, whose first impulse had been to go in to help Pandora, did an abrupt 180-degree turn and began to fly toward open sea for all he was worth. The cloud of mites, which was only a couple of feet from him, rose up into the air and began to chase him. As fast as he flew, the cloud stayed on his tail. Gregor felt himself hit by the same panic Howard had experienced a few moments before. Ares! He cried, hurry! They're right behind you! He felt so helpless he couldn't jump into the water to save his bat. It would be pointless, and anyway, Meredith would just knock him out too. And even if he could get to Ares, how would he stop a cloud of flesh-eating mites? Think, Gregor, he said to himself. What can you do? The cloud was gaining on Ares now. The black edge was almost touching his tail. They were going to eat him. He was going to be devoured by insects, and his skeleton would fall into the water, and wait a minute, that was it. Dive, Ares! Gregor screamed. Dive into the water! At first, Gregor wasn't sure the bat had heard him. Dive! He shrieked. And as the mites began to merge over the line of Ares' tail, the bat dove into the water. Gregor wasn't sure exactly what he thought would happen, but it seemed like people sometimes got in the water to escape from bugs. Bees and things, anyway. If Ares was in the water, they couldn't get him. That was as far as his plan went. It was somewhat limited in effectiveness, since, of course, Ares would soon have to come up for air. But it turned out that Gregor had thought of the right thing after all, because just then the fish, all the wonderful fish, surfaced and began to feast on the mites. The cloud halted and began to counterattack the fish. When Ares came up for air, the mites had forgotten him and were busy battling a new enemy and a potential meal. Flyers, the ropes, Meredith ordered, and Aurora and Andromeda grabbed the front loops on the boat and began to drag the vessel through the water. Ares caught up, and with him carrying the back end, they soon left the island far behind. Meredith had them fly for several miles before he allowed them to put the boat back in the water and land to rest. Ares set his end in the water but did not join them immediately. He dove into the wave again, and finally, after about 20 minutes, came in dripping, exhausted, and trembling. The mites, he explained, some of them latched on and were eating me. I believe I have drowned them all now, though. Are you okay? Gregor asked, giving him an awkward pat. Yes, I'm fine, said Ares. I have only some small wounds, not like... And the bat stopped himself. They all knew who he meant. Gregor toweled Ares off. Luxa helped him go through the black fur inch by inch and apply medicine to wherever the mites had bitten off pieces of his flesh. While they found many wounds, Ares was right. He had left all the bugs in the water. It was good, Overlander, your idea to dive, said Ares. Yes, it was very clever to know the fish would come after the mites, said Luxa. Well, I hadn't really thought it all the way through to the fish part, admitted Gregor. Sure glad they were there, though. When they had finished treating him, Aurora and Andromeda snuggled up against Ares, and the three bats went off to sleep. Gregor was glad Andromeda was no longer shunning his bat. Maybe she'd realized that Aurora would choose Ares over her, and she'd end up alone. Whatever the reason, Gregor thought Ares really needed the company now. Meredith had his hands full steering the boat, so Gregor and Luxa did their best to tend to Howard as well. He was still out. Whoa, that was a pretty big punch. He was still out. They made him a bed, covered him up, and took turns holding cold cloths to his swollen jaw. Do you think we should try to wake him up? Asked Gregor. Luxa shook her head. He has the rest of the life to mourn her. Let him sleep. They were all very quiet that day. The bats slept fitfully. Twitch Tips stared out at the water. Meredith steered. Boots and Temp played little games. The fireflies whispered together on the bough and did not complain. Gregor and Luxa sat side by side watching Boots and Temp. For a long time they were silent. Gregor kept reliving Pandora's horrific death in his head, and he suspected Luxa was doing the same. Finally, as if she couldn't stand it anymore, Luxa spoke up. "Tell me about the Overland, Gregor," she said. "Okay," he said, badly in need of distraction himself. "What do you want to know?" "Oh, anything. Tell me what one day is like from rising to sleep," she said. "Well, it's really different depending on who you are," said Gregor. "Then tell me about one of your days," said Luxa. So he did. He told her about the last day he'd been up there, since it was the freshest in his mind. He told her about how it was Saturday, so there was no school, and how he'd helped Miss Cormac make scalloped potatoes and brought Lizzie the puzzle book, and then he'd taken Boots sledding. He didn't dwell on the lack of food or his dad's illness, since talking about those things made him feel more anxious, and there was enough bad stuff going on around them anyway. He concentrated on the nicer parts of the day. Luxa would ask a question here and there, usually if he used an unfamiliar word, but mostly she just listened. When he finished, she sat thoughtfully for a few minutes. Then she said, "I wish I could see the snow." "You should come up sometime," Gregor said, and she laughed. "No, really, you should come up for a day, or a few hours, or at least it's pretty cool where I live. I mean, it's not a palace or anything, but New York is something else." "You do not think overlanders would find me strange?" asked Luxa. It was a problem. That translucent skin, those violet eyes. "Well, we'll put you in long sleeves and a hat and sunglasses," Gregor said. "You won't look any stranger than about half the people who live there." Suddenly he felt almost enthusiastic about the idea. "And we could go out when it's kind of dark so the sun won't blind you. I mean, even if we just went down the block and got a slice of pizza, that'd be like nothing you've ever seen." They were both happy for a minute, thinking of being in New York, thinking of being somewhere else. Then Luxa sighed and did that thing where she pushed at her crown. "Of course the council would never permit me to go." "Oh yeah, and that's the kind of thing that would stop you?" said Gregor. She gave him a grin and was about to answer when Howard let out a moan. "Pandora," he said. Howard sat up quickly. He had to grab hold of Temp to steady himself. His eyes darted around and landed on the three bats huddled together. He looked upward as if maybe he had dreamt the whole thing and Pandora was flying just overhead. But of course she wasn't. "Pandora," he said. His hand touched his bruised jaw, and he turned to Meredith. "You could not save her, Howard. None of us could," Meredith said gently. Gregor could almost see it, the whole weight of Pandora's death coming down on Howard, crushing him. The Underlander dropped his face into his hands and began to sob. It was heartbreaking to watch. Boots went over and patted him on the back of the neck. "Okay? You okay? You okay, baby?" she said soothingly. This was what they said to her when she was upset. Her sweetness only seemed to make Howard cry harder. Boots looked over at her brother. "Do you go?" he cried. Gregor knew she wanted him to help, to make it better, but it didn't have a clue what to do. Then something unexpected happened. Luxa stood up, her face paler than usual. She went to her cousin, sat beside him, and put her arms around him. Pressing her forehead into his shoulder, she said, "She will fly with you always. You know this. She will fly with you always." Howard buried his face in her lap. She leaned her cheek against the top of his head, and it was a long time before either of them stopped crying. Oh, okay, that was sad. End of chapter 16.